So it's certainly my privilege today to introduce one of those. And Gordon Wusyk, I met actually, Gord, I do have a copy of your book here that I wanted to show. National Tools for Business Families, Drift, Drown, or Decide. And there's an inscription right on the inside. Here's when we originally met, September. That's when we actually met in person. So September 2018. And thank you again for lunch, I believe it was that day. But let me give a little bit of a formal introduction. Gordon Wusyk is the founder and past president and CEO of Predictable Futures, the Business Family Center, and he's the author of the book that I just held up, Drift, Drown, and Decide, and which provides some great tools. And honestly, Gord, talking to you in the last little while, getting to know you a lot more, I understand your book a lot more now. Which is great. Inspired by his own family business perils in the late 1970s, Gordon dedicated over 40 years to studying and understanding the unique challenges that family business owners face. He has spoken across Canada on a variety of topics pertaining to family business continuity and success, which is really what we're going to be talking about today. And his career in the family business field has involved over 5 decades of advising and extensive involvement in national and international family business associations, including his term as national president of the Canadian Association of Family Enterprises and his fellowship status with the Family Firm Institute. And I could go on. He has done a lot, but I tell you, I appreciate Gordon's wisdom, his ability to share that wisdom. And he's one of the most recent graduates of the CKA program. And he messaged me and said, I'm finally a somebody, becoming a certified Kingdom advisor. So I really appreciate, Gordon, your engagement and also your ability to incorporate biblical wisdom into the advice that you share. And one of the phrases that I'm going to borrow from you is about smuggling God into the conversation. And we at Kingdom Advisors tend to be very good at that, learning ways to incorporate biblical wisdom in a winsome way into our practices, into our advice with clients. So most everyone on the call are certainly related in the financial services industry. So as we start, Gordon, I'd like for you to share just a little bit about the painting that's in your lobby. And this may be an unusual start to our conversation, but I think it will create some interesting conversation before. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I have in my lobby, as you come in, a fairly giant-sized print of Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal Son. And it occurred to me many, many years ago when I saw that painting, this masterpiece, that it was, in my mind, the ultimate succession plan. This is a father. He has something that he wants to continue, stewardship of the gospel, passing it on to the next generation. So it talks about fathers, it talks about sons, it talks about sibling rivalries, it talks about a son that wants his inheritance early. Unfortunately, the father gave it to him and he misused it and abused it. And but many years later came back broken, wretched, undeserving, and yet was welcomed back by a father who loved him unconditionally and welcomed him back. Of course, that seemed to create a rivalry with the son who's standing in the side of the painting looking down on this brother who I suspect he feels is completely undeserving. And yet the father didn't communicate with the son who stayed that he was always to be loved and cared for. Just never occurred to the father, maybe, I mean, I'm interpreting it, to share with the sibling who stayed that it was his and it would always have an inheritance. But here was the son who was lost and was coming back now to be involved on his knees in the family business, or the continuity of the gospel, the stewardship of it. So it just struck me that when I sit before that painting, I see myself as a father. I sometimes see myself as a wayward brother, although I didn't get my inheritance early in my case. Or I see myself as a sibling. I see the rivalry. So this painting emotes a lot of those emotions. And I think Rembrandt did a phenomenal job of painting a picture. And then I read Henri Nouwen's book, The Return of the Prodigal Son, which, by the way, if anyone wants to interpret the painting and tear it apart in a real meaningful way, Henri does say that this painting has the entire gospel in it. So I'll just leave it at that. But it's a very meaningful painting. And I have clients come in and I always tell them, here's an ultimate succession plan, which gives me an opportunity from time to time to smuggle a discussion about God into the conversation, because it comes out of Luke, and Rembrandt was being quite spiritual in what he painted. So it opens some doors for a discussion. So
Yeah,
you don't have to have a mess as a family business. You can actually have a masterpiece if you follow some guidelines.
yeah, and that's beautiful to think about it, because until you had mentioned it, and we've all heard the story of the prodigal son, that parable being told. I don't know how many of us have actually considered or thought about that it actually is an example of succession planning if you bring it into our modern day. So it kind of goes back to, okay, we can look at some of these stories, dive in a little deeper, and actually find some biblical principles that we may apply in a given situation. And I studied, received my Bachelor of Theology degree, probably have shared on the prodigal son multiple times, but have never seen business succession planning in that story. So until, Gord, I heard you mention it, and it was like, wow, that's quite interesting. So to dig a little deeper into this and into biblical wisdom, it has a lot to share that I think many advisors don't necessarily realize. There's biblical wisdom to be gained. And one of those that you brought out very well was the conflict between the two brothers, the entitlement, the challenges that come. So let's kind of start off by talking a little bit about businesses in Canada, because that's where we are, that's where we're located. So the significance of the family-owned business in Canada.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of research. In the last 10 or 15 years, this has become a serious field of study. 20 years ago, it was more of a fad, but there are about 1.2 family-owned businesses in the country. They make up about 50 to 55% of the tax revenue. Studies have indicated that about 70% of the new jobs, about 7 million jobs, are handled by family-owned businesses. And of all privately owned businesses in Canada, not public companies, but private companies, those businesses produce about 60% of the tax revenue, and about 85 to 90% of all privately owned businesses are actually family owned or controlled. And interestingly enough, if you look at philanthropy, a little more than 50% of all the philanthropic charitable gifts that are paid to various charities and organizations come from family owned businesses. So the impact of family owned enterprise is pretty profound. In fact, one of my mentors said, if family businesses were to cease to exist for some reason, that it actually would be a socio-economic disaster to our way of life.
Mm-hmm.
So a number of years ago, I watching my own family and seeing other families, I was motivated and drawn to this area because of the profound value of preserving family-owned businesses. And I have been fortunate enough to be mentored and coached by some experts out of the University in Cleveland, Case Western University, Dr. Leon Danko, who became my coach, my mentor, my friend. He was the grandfather of family business consulting and helped to light the passion that I now have and had for many, many decades now in terms of helping family-owned businesses get past the tragedy, because the tragedy is about 70% of family-owned businesses do not successfully make it to the third generation. And given the statistics I just shared with you, that is tragic. And it's a tragedy that does not need to happen. And I think as CKA advisors, we're well positioned to have a discussion about helping families overcome that tragedy.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we certainly want to share, or I want to certainly have you share today, is your unique approach, because you have so much experience in this. This is your specialty, and I love how you even position yourself, often calling yourself an economic pastor to family wealth, family business owners. So that's a pretty neat thing. So your unique approach, can you tell us a little bit about how you approach business owners?
Well, through a lot of the studies with CAFE and the Family Firm Institute, and some of the work done by the Harvard Business School, Dr. John Davis and others, is that I discovered earlier on that family businesses are a system. When I meet a family business, I actually run into three organizations all wrapped up into one. So a family business is the system. It's like three circles. There's the family itself, which is one of the circles. There is the business itself, which is another circle. And then there's the ownership, which is a third circle. And where these circles intersect, you can see there's if you look at each one of those segments that's created by connecting these circles together, there's 7 different possible relationships that can take place. And whenever you're talking to a family or a family-owned business, you might be talking to somebody wearing the family hat. It could be someone wearing the business hat. It could be someone talking about the ownership hat. And the conversation you might be having with someone can move back and forth. You can be in the family and not in the business and don't own shares, or you could be in the family and actually be employed by the business, or you might be in the family and own shares but not be employed, or you could be in the family, in the business, and own shares, like the founder, plays all. That would be the dead center where the circles intersect. And this is a very dynamic model depending on the kind of conversation you're having. And when I talk to a founder or a business owner about this, I can indicate that if you're wearing a family hat, there's certain attributes and goals and objectives you would have depending on which circle you're standing in. And maybe we can take a look at each one of these briefly. If you're talking about the family and you're wearing a family hat, that's what I call the emotional component of the 3 circles. That's where nurturing takes place. The love is unconditional, the equality of affection. You love them all equally, quite often treat them all equally. That's where personal development takes place. So that's if you're wearing the family hat. That's more the softer relationship issues. And you can't get out of that circle. You're born into the family. You can't sort of escape from it. You're in the family. You're born into it. So that's a little bit of perspective if you're wearing the family hat. Another circle might be the ownership. If you own the shares, that's where the power is. If you're wearing an ownership hat and you're having a conversation with somebody who's thinking like an owner, they're thinking about return on investment, return of investment, diligent management, stewardship of the assets, maybe a board of directors. But that's much more structured, much more business-like. The reputation of the owners, that's how you will be thinking. So you'd be wearing a different hat. And then in the last circle, you'd be looking at the business. That's very structured. It has an infrastructure. There's regular reviews. There's Systems, you're looking at systems and processes and management, competency, you're looking at results, bottom lines, fair market value, strategic planning, that sort of thing. It's fast, efficient decisions. So there's a degree of accountability here, and you can be asked to leave the business if you don't live up to certain standards and certain competencies. Whereas in the family, of course, you're not reviewing your people in the family the same way you'd review people in the business. So you might. Uh, I have a story which I won't tell now, but I got fired from my father's business in the moving business when I was in my early 20s for good reason. He fired me because I didn't live up to the standards that were required by his other employees, and I went to work in the construction business somewhere else. He didn't love me any less, but he wasn't about to employ me in the business. Uh, so getting fired by my father in the family business was actually a pretty good lesson for me in many ways.
Yeah, it's interesting as you describe it, the different hats that the business owner wears, which you've brought out extremely well. So you've talked obviously to lots of business owners. How challenging are those conversations when you have those, and how significant is it that you point out that you're wearing different hats at different times?
Well, it's interesting when you're talking with a founder, the idea of accountability. A lot of these founders are wrestling with what to do next. They're stuck. They didn't know they were going to become this successful or this wealthy or the business would become this big. It's not one truck and one shovel in one location anymore. He's had it 35 or 40 years. And now it's, many trucks and many shovels in many locations, fairly significant value. But when he sees these three circles intersecting, he can see that conflict is inevitable and inherent, and it's built right into the business. You can, if you put your son into a position in terms of bringing them into the business, they might be competent as a son and competent as a family member, but they might not be very competent in terms of actually running the business. So automatically putting them into a business management role, or even putting them into an ownership role. But sometimes I'll sit with a founder or father and we'll look at where the business is strategically going, and then we'll look at what the leadership attributes and or skills and ability might be needed in order to take the business to that destination. So we'll list all the attributes. What will this company need to get to its next level?
Mm-hmm.
And then sit down with him and take his son or daughter and list all the attributes and skills and abilities they have, and see if all those attributes and skills will actually match up with what the skills and abilities will be needed by the business in terms of taking it to the next level. So in some cases, I have to tell a father that the skills and abilities and attributes that this business needs after I've done a situational assessment are not possessed by his son or daughter, which means they might need some more training or some more experience, or it might be that they are simply not the right choice, even though that may have been the aspiration of the founder. And maybe it would be wise to have professional management in the business instead of a son or a daughter. And maybe we should be assisting the founder with preparing his kids to be good owners, but not good managers, to take them out of management entirely. I think of Paul Martin, the previous Prime Minister of Canada, Canadian Steamship Lines. His kids were never involved in the management of the business, but they were involved in the ownership on the advisory board. But if you take a look at that slide, Lord, on conflict, it's built right into the system because the family, your goal as a family is to support your family members, but the business is it's profits, revenues, and growth.
Mm-hmm.
And the rules for governing the family are pretty informal expectations, softer relationship, emotional issues. But the rules in the business are formal and written rewards, and there's rewards for performing, and there are punishments for not performing. You can be fired. I know, I experienced it. Now, the evaluation, in the family, your rewards are based on who you are. It's unconditional. But in the business, it's all about performance. And succession, sometimes in the family, is caused by death or divorce. But in the business, it's retirement, promotion, or departure. So I think it's important for family owners to understand that conflict is built right into the system. When you draw those three circles and put them together and get 7 different kinds of relationships, it's inevitable and inherent that conflict. In fact, I don't think, quite honestly, in the 4 decades of working with families, that I have ever run into a family where some conflict did not exist.
Hmm.
But I do point out that conflict is healthy if you can talk about it in a transparent way. It's unresolved conflict that is so unhealthy. And which leads me to what we've discovered is that a lot of reasons that family businesses don't get to the 3rd generation is not because they don't have what they've got good lawyers and good accountants and good financial advisors and good tax planners. What they don't have is useful, meaningful, honest communication and trust within the family unit. So the softer issues are left unattended, and then when we bring in, it's what I discover with lawyers, accountants, financial advisors, and so on, is that we tend to bring, or we quite often bring our specialty to the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's what I call technical myopia. I think that would be a good way to describe it. Is
Mm-hmm.
that, if the only thing you have in your hand is a hammer, then everything starts to look like a nail.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so
It,
it's premature to get into the technical discussion and leave it at that level, because you don't get a succession solution. You get a silo bit of advice, which doesn't really give you a succession plan.
Yeah, which kind of makes me think that as financial professionals, many times we tend to get caught there because we focus on what we feel we are there to do, which in many cases the sense is, okay, I'm here to talk about the money aspect, to talk about the transfer of wealth from one generation to the next. So it's more the dollars conversation, more the transactional. And what you're talking about is a lot of the soft skills, which will eventually lead to the technical, the money conversation, the dollars conversation. But I wonder if many times we've actually bypassed the actual need. And the actual need is the resolve of the conflict that's inherently present. And I wonder how many advisors never actually even recognize that there is conflict that's present and therefore never address it.
Well, I think what happens is that one of the terms that I use is that we try to focus on values before focusing on valuables.
Hmm.
And focusing on values requires a different kind of a conversation. It's a conversation with a family. It's what I call a family council, where you gather the family together and you talk about vision, mission, goals, roles. Who wants to be in the business?
Mm-hmm.
What's going to be required if you stay in this business? This is just not an opportunity, if you pardon the term. This is just not a place for the lucky sperm club to land. Uh, you have to make a contribution. You have to be prepared. And what are your values, and what are your missions, and what are your goals? Quite often, a son or a daughter doesn't have the opportunity to have that conversation and to share with their father or their father and mother that their passion is not the same DNA that their parents had. They don't have the same entrepreneurial passion, and yet they feel compelled at times to follow the father's motivation to come into the family business, and then 5 or 6 years later, they find out they're trapped in the family business doing something they don't love to do, and wrestle with how do I explain to my parents that this is not what I wanted to do. So
Hmm.
if we can have family council meetings, and we have a very structured family council process where we can identify the relationships and have open, transparent, uh, honest conversations about what each of the goals are. In fact, we do follow a process where I normally interview all of the family members in advance of having the family meeting. So after I've clarified the dreams and aspirations of the founder, then I want to sit down and have a meaningful one-on-one conversation with each one of the family members to find out what their goals, aspirations, and dreams are, and find out if that does match the founder. And then thirdly, it's important to look at the business itself. Where is this business going? Where is it aligned strategically? And
Hmm.
does where the business want to go match up with the goals and aspirations of the next generation? And does it match up with the goals and aspirations of the parents? So before that's what the family council discussion does. And as you go through those steps in the process, then you can start to prepare successors. Then you can start to choose the next leader. And then you can choose and train the new owners. And then you can start to build the legacy and the estate plan, because people don't realize in succession, there's 3 successions that are going on. There's leadership succession,
Hmm.
there's management succession, and there's ownership succession. There's 3 different types of successions. So until you have some of these soft issue discussions so you can prioritize what the issues are and what the goals and aspirations of the next generation are, then it's what you should never shower with your clothes on.
Okay, now you're going to have to explain that one.
Well, you need to do things in a proper sequence. You don't jump in the shower with your suit on. So you
Right.
don't get into all the tax and legal structuring until you at least have attempted to have a meaningful, value-based, emotional, psychological relationship kind of discussion. Now that you know who wants to be in, who doesn't want to be in, what their goals and aspirations are, now you can prioritize some next steps, and then you can start to get some meaningful. Now you can talk about the legal. Now you can talk about the tax. Now you can talk about the agreements. And then you can have some meaningful discussion, maybe even about philanthropy. Even in the family meeting, we talk about, what is the purpose of wealth? This is where you can do some God smuggling as well, in terms of what is the purpose. I'll sometimes ask families, it's quite a coincidence that you have accumulated so much money and so much wealth. Uh, have you ever thought about the excess, the surplus? You want to pass it all on to the next generation, or is there something you might want to do in the community in terms of giving back? And that can lead into a philanthropic, charitable discussion. Uh, how much is enough, and who owns it all? Uh,
Hmm.
you can get into, are you blessed for a particular reason to bless others, or is my job just to make rich people richer, which doesn't highly motivate me. Uh,
Right.
but it's a good conversation to get into.
And the reality is, I've found it doesn't motivate a lot of advisors. Actually, a lot of Christian advisors find a lot of dissatisfaction in the sense of just building up someone's assets, increasing their net worth. There's not a lot of satisfaction in that because it doesn't address the question of how much is enough. The one thing that I thought was interesting, Gord, what you shared is about your process. Again, it kind of starts with the founder's dreams, the personal vision. I think that's significant. And it makes me think about the verse in Proverbs, where there's no vision, the people perish. Or we could say, where there's no vision, the business is going to perish. And that's kind of the starting point, the important point as well, even with the successors. Is it their own vision? And, bypassing that conversation is very, very challenging. So there's a comment that's just come in. And by the way, I want to open it up. If you have a comment or a question The chat box is there in the lower right portion of the screen. Open that chat box up and add your comments there. But I wanted to read this, Gordon, and just get your response to it. And this is a comment that says, I used to think that the low percentage of family businesses that make it to the second generation was a failure. After advising family businesses for a decade, I changed my mind. Over the last 30 years, I have become more and more convinced that a business that doesn't make it to the second generation is not a failure, but a success. Many families have been spared a great deal of intergenerational problems by being wise enough to know that the family business was not meant to be passed on. So you've kind of addressed this, I think, already, but love to have your comment from that as well.
No, I think that's absolutely true. In some businesses ought not to be part of a succession plan. Maybe should be sold to a third party, or should be merged with another company, or bring in private equity to let them run the business. Or maybe the business should be wound up. It may be, it's becoming sort of archaic. And so rather than putting people through all those conflicts, you can avoid that by having the meaningful conversations in the family. You can identify some of those issues and those reasons. And sometimes the selling of the business or winding it up is much better. And then you just distribute the cash to the siblings or to the community or to both. But I think that comment that was made by whoever made it is a very wise, understandable, legitimate comment.
Good. He goes by the name Sherlock. I don't know if you know him, but that's I've chatted with him. He is in Winnipeg, the Winnipeg area. So and he is an accountant for sure. So that's kind of his background, and he's been in the industry a long time. I do know that.
And there are some very wise accountants that help with some of these softer issues and would give that advice, which would be advice that some businesses should take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the big point is the softer issues. And if you go back to where we started with the prodigal son, it is really a lesson in dealing with the softer issues as opposed to, I guess, the hard issues, the technical things. And they probably didn't have well, maybe they did have accountants in that day. I don't know. but it's interesting that the focus of that is more on the relationship side. And you think back at those three circles that you mentioned and kind of finding what the role is. And the father in that story seems to have worn all of those hats.
Well, it's pretty easy to pass on the shares. That's a legal transaction or a tax transaction or a paper transaction. You can convert the shares to preferred shares and freeze the value and pass on the growth to the next generation. Passing on the shares is illegal. It's a transactional issue. But passing on the issues, now being able to handle the issues of running a business, managing a business, and leading a business, that's a lot different than just receiving the shares. The shares are just receiving a legal transaction. But that does not equip you to deal with the issues of running a business. That's a whole different discussion.
Yeah. And Ruby has commented that she agrees primarily the true meaning of stewardship and working as a family office style of financial advisors for 25 years. She's now working in mergers and acquisitions. Often the family of believers look at a sale as the starting point of other stewardship opportunities. So I think you would certainly agree with that. The sale of a business creates a significant opportunity.
Yeah, you go from being a family enterprise to maybe being an enterprising family. You've converted all your assets to cash or into investments, and now you have a large family holding company, and you're not managing a business now, but now you're managing wealth, which is a different set of challenges in terms of how you steward that wealth, what you do with it, and that brings into the conversation the whole charitable philanthropic side. Quite often in family meetings, I'll sit around the table with 8 or 10 family members, and we'll play a game saying, "I'm going to give you each $100,000 check and issue each person a check and say, now that you have this 100,000 in your hand, you must give this money away within 90 days. You can't spend a penny of it. Where would you give it and why?
Mm-hmm.
And you can start a family conversation around the table about their thoughts about giving money away. Where would they give it and why would they give it? And you can start now a conversation, an aggregate conversation on the values, goals, and aspirations of individual family members in terms of what they would do if they were forced to give away money within a short period of time. Now you can start to build a value statement around philanthropy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. That's awesome to have conversation like that, and I love those exercises because those questions often are not something that the participants would have thought about previously. Can you talk to us a little bit as well about the personalities of business owners?
Yeah, when I meet a founder, and it's quite often I meet a founder up front, although sometimes it's a spouse who calls me and who said they're the sandwich in the meat between the kids and the founder. And so they're saying, can you help me through a process that I'm wrestling with between my husband and my kids? But when I meet a founder of a business or an owner, I meet the owner. That's one part of the personality. He's focused on growth and his potential maybe exit strategy, uh, which he thinks will take place sometimes, but not anytime soon. Letting go is kind of a wrestling issue with him. Or
Mm-hmm.
I might meet the aging male, aging physiologically, aging psychologically, old, tired, harassed, frustrated, and running out of time as they're getting older and somewhat stuck in this dilemma. Or I sometimes meet the best employee. He's the first in and the last out, turns out the lights. He's there Saturdays and sometimes Sundays. And then you might meet the manager, who is the person who hires, fires, and organizes people. But it's interesting. I can meet all four personalities within an hour of having a discussion with a founder because he has
Mm-hmm.
conflicting roles, multiple priorities, and can be quite frustrated and uncomfortable. And when we start to talk about a process, start to talk about the three circle model, start to talk about the fact that conflict is healthy and that there is a process you can follow to get unstuck, he certainly then starts to feel a bit more comfortable that there is a way out of the mess, and maybe it is possible to create somewhat of a masterpiece if you follow a set of rules and some guidelines, and if you can deal with more effective communication and therefore build trust. Now you can have a transparent conversation in a family meeting, and the values that need to be identified get identified, and people then get allowed to share what their thoughts and goals and aspirations are. And he can even share some of his fears and concerns and attitudes towards competency of his children, who he feels is competent and who he feels might not be competent to run the business, but might be very competent to be the head of the family foundation. Or
Mm-hmm.
maybe the successful business can have enough financing or enough capital to finance some of the aspirations of some of the other kids, even though that might mean not being involved in the business at all. The family can set up a family bank and finance other things that the children may be gifted at, but not necessarily trap them within the family business. So those discussions get meaningful when I have a discussion with this, what I call the four-part personality that I run into when I meet a founder of a business.
What's your experience been in many of those family meetings, the challenges that can come? Can discussions get pretty heated? A family member, even the owner, feeling the awkwardness of his or her position. Is there an awkwardness to it? And do you have any advice in that sort of area, how to deal with that? Because you're saying there's inherent conflict in the owner, but I'm sure there is conflict as well with the owner and the next generation?
Well, even to have the family meeting itself, to convince the founders to put all of the family together in one room and to have this discussion is a challenge in itself. Uh,
Hmm.
but sometimes I can assist the owner by letting him know that he will not be the facilitator or the leader of the meeting. He can just actually be a participant in the meeting. Where, and I, of course, I have an agenda that I'm, which is more a bit of a perspective that I have, that it's valuable to have a third party facilitator so the conversation can be structured. And I normally send the agenda in advance to the founder and to the participants. And I'll also ask some of the participants what things they would like to put on the table on the agenda so that nobody is surprised coming in to the family meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So we can have that meeting. And we normally don't try to attack all the big issues, excuse me, all up front. We just try to go through having a meaningful, interactive discussion. In fact, we sometimes go around the table and do some, I can't explain it here, we don't have enough time, but we do some affirmation techniques by going around the table and getting people to share some meaningful personal thoughts they have, the things they most love and like about other people in the room, to try to set the tone for some
Mm.
very positive affirmations
Yeah, that's
before
good.
we get into the more thorny, more difficult issues. Uh, but a facilitated family council, as a matter of fact, what I've discovered over the years that uh, while we're on this topic is that there's three things that enduring families in business who succeed in succession always do. They always have family meetings that are at least initiated with some facilitation. They always start to think about having some type of strategic plan. And thirdly, they think about putting some governance structure, which is a whole separate discussion here, because when you have a family in business, you have to have governance structures, not just for the business. You need a governance structure for the family, you need a governance structure for the business, and you need a governance structure for the ownership. So there's three different types of governance structures. So getting into this whole issue of advisory boards and governance structures becomes a very meaningful conversation.
So is there a size, because that seems pretty complicated, pretty detailed to get into all of this. So is there a size where the business is that needs to happen? Or is it generally the case if it's a business running with future generations involved, that this is something that should be done?
Well, in most cases, I'm working in the area between $5 and $50 million in terms of businesses of, in that general category. But we've run into businesses that are only worth maybe $3 or $4 million, relatively small, but they have some real growth potential in terms of taking themselves to the next level. So they might start off looking like a pretty small business in terms of valuation, but they have either a technology or they have some giftedness within the family. Uh, there might be some opportunity not only for what I call entrepreneurship, but intrapreneurship, where the tools, techniques, skills, clients, capital involved in the family business, you can leverage some of those to help the family with other activities in terms of other kinds of businesses. Or
Mm-hmm.
you might split the business off into two or three different businesses, depending on what kind of business it is. But that's where you have the discussions in those family meetings.
Once again, I'll just open it up. If anybody has a comment or a question, if you got a question, we're going to take probably the next 10 minutes or so to answer any questions that you might have or respond to any comments. One comment, Gord, that has come in is very excited about the family bank strategy, where the holdco is used like a traditional bank to fund the family and key employees' own passions, innovations, their own stewardship pool. And like the parable of the talents, they must give an account of their stewardship, pay for the debt like at regular financing. rewarded with more responsibility when a success is achieved. Give star employees, managers incentives and encouragement, and yet the family as a whole benefits. It has worked so well. Yeah.
That's absolutely true. I've seen some families where we suggest to the family, if a family member is not going to be involved in the business, but if they have a business idea, if they come with a business plan, a detailed structure, outline what the financing would look like, and they've got it laid out to present to the family meeting. There's a family we work with in Vancouver where someone has a software idea that had nothing to do with running the actual family business. That software idea turned out to be multi-millions of dollars, almost worth as much as the family business itself. That was financed by the family bank, and they participated. I took a minority position in that case, but they structured it with family financing.
Yeah, that's it's powerful to think about what can come from these conversations. That's for sure. I wanted to put up a quote, Gord, that you had in your book, and as you said, it was borrowed from U.S. President Ronald Reagan. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the ability to handle conflict by peaceful means. I think that's a wonderful quote, and something that we as financial professionals need to keep in mind when we are dealing with challenging conversations that we tend to have with clients from time to time.
Well, I think if we go to the slide, Lauren, on the holistic approach, that's a large circle that talks about when we look at a family-owned business, this is when your family and your business, it's a multi-dimensional process because, first of all, it's a multifaceted problem, and multi-disciplines are required to solve the succession issue. And if you go around the circle, there's the family personal relationships, which we've been talking about quite a bit here. That's the softer issues, and values before the valuables. But there is tax planning, minimization. You don't want to give CRA more than their unfair share. There's wealth management. There's retirement strategies for the founder. How much is enough? How much do they need to retire on? Do they need a large amount of capital, or do they just need an income for the balance of their life? What about protecting creditor protection? What about charitable giving? Even in Christian families, there's issues about family law, about sticky issues like marriage contracts and prenuptial agreements, legal documents, estate equalization, where you've got some family members who don't fit in the business. That brings up a whole topic we can talk about called fair versus equal. Fair does not mean equal, and equal does not mean fair. Sometimes fair means equitable, or fair means treating each individual family member uniquely, but not necessarily equally. And then, of course, there's death taxes. In the Canadian tax system, you're deemed to have disposed of your assets the moment before you die at fair market value. And so there's a pound of flesh. And some of these things will require a psychologist. We have 2 psychologists on our team. Some of it will require a really good lawyer or a tax specialist or organizational development expert, somebody good in operational audits or strategic planning. But what I'm saying to our CKA advisors, there's an opportunity here to be the facilitator or the quarterback of this discussion, and to see it as a holistic issue. And someone needs to herd the cats around the table to give it some leadership and deal with. And I can't think a CKA advisor with good, sound biblical training understands that the ultimate reconciler for lots of conflict, we know this, that Jesus is the most outstanding reconciler you could possibly imagine. And if we can smuggle some of his principles into the discussion, how he led, how he dealt with teams, how he built. He took 12 people, 3 of them on his executive team and 12 of them, and here we are 2,000 years later, and the profound impact that his leadership skills demonstrated. There's lots of books written on the leadership skills as outlined by Christ himself through Scripture.
Think about your business as you watch this short video, and we'll come back for a few comments in a moment.
Where is God stirring you to dream in the dark? Where is God stirring you to see beyond the status quo of what society has settled for? Where is God stirring you to look and inspect issues in our day, issues in your field, issues in your industry that everybody's like, it's just how it is. We just accept it is what it is. But God has given you a dream for something more. Where do you see a new chapter that God wants to write? You see, a resilient leader doesn't just hang on and wait for kingdom come. The resilient leader engages and says, thy kingdom come. The resilient leader engages and said, God, what does it look like for your kingdom to come in this moment? The resilient leader is resilient for a reason. And the reason is God is moving and God isn't done. And so they just want to be available and ready to be part of it.
Think about that. God is moving. Now, we often think in terms of God moving in the sense of church work and all of those sorts of things. But we need to broaden our perspective of where God is moving. And God could actually be moving into conversations through the conversations that we are having with clients. And she talked about the status quo. And I think there's very much a status quo in this industry that we often as Christians settle for. But I just believe that God is stirring a dream for some of us, that within this industry, there is an opportunity for God to be active in the conversations that we have. And Gord is really talking about the soft skills. That's where God is most active, I think, is even in the still small voice. It's quite interesting. And we can't just wait. We can't just be people who just wait for his kingdom to come. We need to engage and say, thy kingdom come. I just thought that was extremely powerful. So we need to think about the moments that we have in conversations with clients, the opportunities that we have for his kingdom to come in the midst of that. And I would say to you that God is actually challenging you even today to be part of this industry of Christian financial advice.
This idea of a calling, Lord, when my father died suddenly of a heart attack at age 59 and left three sons and a daughter, and no plan, he left a mess, not a masterpiece. And I discovered that there must be a better way to deal with the broken and strained relationships that take place when something like that happens.
Mm-hmm.
I had a brother who thought he should get the farm and he didn't get the farm. He hardly spoke to me for 15 or 18 years in terms of the broken and strained relationships. I met this fellow at Case Western University that gave me some insights. And this idea of working with the broken and strained relationships that you see in many family-owned businesses, I saw this and really see it even now as more of a mission and a calling. Because we can take some of these family-owned businesses and improve the quality of their conversations, bring into the conversation some of the biblical principles that we've learned through CKA and other sources to help people communicate better, to love each other more unconditionally, to talk about values rather than valuables, to talk about the soft conflicting issues that can take the business to the next level before being prematurely selling it. There's some really meaningful conversations that take place, and the reward, a lot of the people we talk to will never walk into a church, but we can be the church or the Jesus they never see in the boardroom of their family businesses and share some values with them that they might never hear. And with the 2,350 verses that deal with finance, economics, succession, and business in Scripture, there are some truths there that are profound that we are called to share.
Yeah, and that's exactly the reason why I'm hosting these monthly calls is exactly that, is to have people like yourself, Gordon, share that biblical wisdom so we get it, because there is so much industry wisdom out there. But when we couple that with biblical wisdom, it's kind of like we hit that sweet spot we're part of this Christian financial advice. We're part of that. And I would encourage any of you who are on this call today, if you're not engaged with Kingdom Advisors, you ought to be. And there's a few ways to do that is through the study groups that are happening every month. And by the way, the study group this month, it's interesting. The speaker is Howard Dayton, and he was key in actually counting those 2,350 verses to determine the verses that would be. So would be there. So that's pretty neat. So one question, how do we get your book is one question that's come in, and I can put your contact information. But Gord, if you want to talk a little bit about your book before we wrap up, we'd also have to look at the assessment in a moment as well. But how do we get your book?
Just send a note to Gordon@predictablefutures.com. It's people buy it there, and we have ample copies for people who are interested in it. And almost everything we've talked about is talked about in one shape or form or another in the book. Diagrams, the 3-circle model, the conflict. This is a distillation of about 25 or 30 years of advising family business. And someone asked me, why don't I write a book about what I've been doing over these 3 decades? And it's a navigational tools for family businesses in transition.
Mm-hmm.
And so send me a note to the website or Gordon@predictablefutures, and I'll make sure that those things are made available to you.
That's awesome. Question from Abe Taves. How would you proceed if dad passed away some 12 years ago? Mom, with the help of one son and a key person, has grown the business. Now mom wants out, but does not want to hear that selling may be the best option.
Well, I think following the process we talked about, entering into a discussion with her about meeting with family members, meeting with the son who's still in the business, meeting with her, and structuring a family meeting to talk about values, vision, mission, and goals of the family, and then to come out with a set of prioritizations out of that family meeting, and to talk about the value of keeping the business and to see where it might go strategically, comparing that to if you sold the business and what that would do in terms of the community, in terms of family, in terms of employment, in terms of creating maybe a business where other lives could flourish because you've created a business that creates employment and makes charitable gifts to the community. That's the kind of discussion I would have with her.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Very good. Hopefully, Abe, that addresses answers your question. One comment from Kevin, who is, I believe, in the Calgary area. He says, wonderful to hear this from a Christian perspective. I have been reading and using Dr. Thomas Dean's ideas for estate and family business planning this last couple of years. And he looks forward to reading your book. So sales are going to boom from here by the sounds of it.
Well, Thomas Deans is a very close friend of mine, and we've spoken together. We agree and we disagree on some issues, but he is very candid, and he does bring up some phenomenally good tools. He's got a book called Willing Wisdom, and in fact, I learned from the CKA course. I've known it before, but wisdom creates wealth. Wealth passed on to the next generation does not create wisdom. And how to pass on wealth. One of the great attributes you pass on to the next generation is not your wealth, but it's your wisdom. And how do you go about passing that on? Those tools are valuable.
Yep, absolutely. So we want to wrap up with this, which is the Readiness Tool. Now, you are able to enlarge this if it's small on your screen in the bottom right corner. You can enlarge, but it's a set of questions, business, family, succession, readiness, assessment tool. That's a mouthful for sure, but I love the first question. Does your family have a shared vision for the future? Even the fourth question, has your family agreed on a strategy for resolving disagreements or conflicts? So Gordon, I don't know if you want to make some comments, walk us through that a little bit.
Well, it's a tool, and that's all it is. But that first question: if there is no vision, the people perish. And number 4, if you don't know where you're going, then any road will get you there, or maybe you're already on the road leading you to a poor destination. But this checklist just gives you a scorecard. I find it, what the checklist does, as people go through it, I normally have people in the family each complete this checklist on their own without sharing their answers with each other and sending the checklist back to me, so I can see how different people in the family have completely different perspectives on their readiness or unreadiness, or I can also see that they are in absolute harmony. But the questions are outlined in such a way that they identify the kinds of things you need to go through in terms of the overall succession planning process. You would need to have yes answers to most of these questions in order to get a scorecard on page 3 that shows you that you are extraordinarily ready for succession, or you are, if you got a lower score at the bottom below the normal, I think there's one below on mine, that you're not ready at all. But at least gives people some kind of a objective tool to give them a bit of a scorecard. And scorecards are useful, at least indicating that there is work to do and what that work might look like. At least opens the conversation for some meaningful next steps.
Awesome. And so that's great. I guess most are not going to score extraordinary. They're probably going to be a lot lower than that typically. And we do have to wrap up our time. But if you want to make a closing comment there, Gord, on that.
No, I just think that, I mean, if you leave the people with this tool and they go through it and do what I've suggested, it gives you an automatic next step, because it almost always leads to further discussion with some momentum.
All right, that's great. We've had some great feedback and really appreciate it. Next month, my plan is to have a speaker to talk a little bit more about actually what Joe Saxton brought up, which is resilience. That's the plan for next month for April. Gord, I'm wondering if you would like to or would be satisfied to close our time together in prayer. A couple of people have had to run for their next meeting, which is quite understandable. We try and do it within an hour, but it's easy to run over. So we appreciate everyone's time for being here. So if you could close us, that would be awesome.
Be happy to. Father, we just thank you for this time. We thank you for the many small, medium entrepreneurs around the country who energize our economy and make such a contribution. Thank you for people on this call, advisors who are wanting to know more. Thank you for the privilege, in my own case, of having the opportunity to serve some of these families and to learn as much from them as they learn from me. Help us to delve more deeply into God's word and the direction it gives in so many ways to answer meaningful questions about the need for reconciliation and how these principles, Jesus's lifestyle, his methods, the way he lived his life and the way he provided leadership, are tools we can use to introduce people to the ultimate reconciliator and to help them have momentum in getting some succession in a meaningful direction in their own lives and in their own businesses. Thank you for this time. Thank you for Lauren, for him putting this together. We just pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Once again, I'm going to put the contact information up on the screen as we leave. I know one of Gordon's passions is to even mentor the younger generation. So feel free to reach out to him, connect with him for resources, advice, and counsel. And I hope I'm not extending or stretching you too thin.
No, I'm happy to respond. In my twilight years, that is the role I love to play.
All right. Blessings, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your week.